Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to these times, set pages and representation. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying the AQA GCSE Media Studies specification as they currently appear as a set text on that spec. We'll start by having a look at the representation of women within this article. Paula Vennells obviously appears in a very large image on the front cover. Her formal pose, the red suit, all suggest that she's quite powerful and quite successful. They call her former chief executive, which suggests that she had a high level of control and power in this situation. And this representation does challenge ideas about gender. We often think of women in the media as being shown in more submissive roles, as weaker roles, and not necessarily being shown in powerful business or professional roles, whereas she is. So challenging ideas about representation of women in the media. Although obviously still a fairly negative representation of what happens when women are powerful and successful in the media. The smile, though, the choice of this image represents her as being fairly happy despite this, apparent scandal and shocking situation. So it makes her seem quite cold emotionally, like she doesn't really care about what's happened. It kind of suggests that she's incompetent, unfit, that she shouldn't have been in this role. And perhaps this targets the fact that the Times newspaper has a predominantly male readership. Her lack of empathy and the wording they use, the image they use, all kind of represents her as the villain in this story. Female readers might not respond to this representation as well as male readers. Although we've got this representation of Paula Vennells on the front cover being quite powerful, we've also got an article mentioned about dress for your shape, suggesting that there's still an importance for women about beauty standards. There's still a focus on what you look like. So there are some gender stereotypes for women still evident on this cover. When mentioning the government, they often use names and titles, so exactly what role they have within the government, and these labels give them a sense of authority and power. There is a bit where they say they could pass an emergency law. It does suggest the government might help, but that it's a little bit late. It doesn't point fingers at the Labour government though, which suggests that perhaps the newspaper is a little bit more neutral politically. That political representation being fairly neutral is reasonably common in the Times newspaper. They try and stay fairly politically neutral despite leaning more to the right. However, they do show the Conservative government in a slightly more positive light, suggesting that the Tory MPs are going to take some action. And that's potentially reflective of the fact that a lot of their audiences are Conservative voters, so it makes sense to represent them in a slightly more positive light. You could also have a look at the representation of class, this discussion of MPs, of very rich, wealthy business people, elites, wearing kind of suits and having titles, mentioning their £2.2 million pound bonuses. It makes them seem very privileged in comparison to the rest of the nation, very elite, and perhaps out of touch with the average working class people. And I think the Times newspaper does have a fairly middle to upper class readership, but I think it's targeting those middle class readers who are going to potentially identify with this feeling that upper class people are still the villains. It's worth noting that all of the people pictured in this scandal who have been guilty of something are all represented as white, and they're all represented as rich and upper class. And so perhaps tying this idea of class to ethnicity, the idea that if you are going to be powerful and rich in Britain, perhaps it's more likely that you are going to be white. And this perhaps represents things like institutionalised racism, particularly in high-powered, high-level, high-status jobs. The post office and Fujitsu are also being represented in a fairly negative way. Corporate, faceless bureaucracies, unaccountable, all about hierarchy and power, lots of phrases like cover-ups and scandal. It makes them seem secretive and mysterious and like companies we can't trust. In fact, the people who worked for the IT company for Fujitsu were also represented as very secretive and guilty. The candid photos of the man hiding behind the door looking very surprised make him seem very guilty to a reader. The sub-postmasters here, they are definitely represented as the victims in all of this. The human interest stories, it makes them feel real, it makes them feel relatable. The phrases wrecked lives represents them as victims, suffering, and it invites us to sympathise with them as an audience. So it creates this very sympathetic view of them, a real representation of them being the victims in this narrative. So that is my easy to understand guide to representation in these set pages. Don't forget to subscribe if you want other videos that are relevant for you, including for this set text. And if you would like a video that I don't already have, leave a little comment below and I'll add it to my to-do list.